Hi. Um, I was actually thinking I'd like to start by saying a prayer. Okay, so let's pray. Father, thank you for your kindness to us, for your goodness. Show us how to think about these things. Our lives are difficult and full of struggle at times, and also full of grace and joy. And I thank you that we can look at these things together. Give us wisdom and insight. In Jesus' name, amen. So I had a dream the other night, about a week ago, that a lot of things happened, and I showed up here and I hadn't had a chance to prepare anything. One of those, like, end of the school year things, you get to a class and you haven't been there all year and you have to take the final or something like that. Still happens. But I got here and I thought, well, I'll just wing it, because I talk about this stuff all the time. And so after that dream, I don't know. I mean, I might be kind of winging it, but hopefully we'll see where this goes. So Larry talked last week about psychology and kind of how Jesus interacted with the Pharisees and with his disciples in a way that was on a lot of different levels, very psychological and very insightful. And certainly that is one way that we think of psychology, is kind of how our inner workings work, how we interact with each other, in that sense that Larry used it last week. That's certainly been around a long time. The Greek goddess Psyche, it's the goddess of the soul, kind of talks about the inner. There's big myth, of course, that goes with her that I won't go into, but the science of psychology is much newer than that. And that really began with Freud, and that's something Paul is going to talk about maybe in a couple weeks, is some of the history and roots. But I am going to talk a little bit about sort of how we think about, if we're thinking about, is the purpose of psychotherapy to seek truth or to feel better. Larry alluded to it last week too, that the field has gone through a lot of changes in recent years. And I thought it might be good to start with just kind of a talk about what would it mean to feel better? What do we even mean by happiness? What are we after? And by the way, I would love for this to be a conversation. So if you think of questions, one of the things that I struggled with as I was prepping is, I don't know what these folks would be asking me. So if you guys have particular questions, I welcome you to keep them in mind, and we'll have a conversation along the way as well. Okay. So I think this will come into what I talk about in a minute, about sort of the whole idea of feeling better or seeking truth. Because I think that how we define happiness is really significant. So again, back to the Greeks, they would have used the word eudaimonia, and that has been loosely translated happiness. But they had a much richer, fuller definition of that, and happiness is a pretty weak translation. What they had in mind, as far as I can understand it, is sort of the idea of human flourishing, or kind of finding our fulfillment, finding our value. And I think that for many of the Greeks, that included the idea of seeking virtue and doing what was good and seeking the good. And so I think that's a significant thing when we think about what we're influenced by, and our whole ideas about psychotherapy and how we think about the development of the self, and all that stuff is so influenced by the context that we're in now. And we are much more impacted by probably, I would say, many influences, but one of them is certainly the utilitarians, who changed that definition to happiness as the absence of pain, basically. It's pleasure. It's seen as pleasure, the absence of pain, rather than any sense of, like, what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to be fully human, and to find meaning in this existence. So I think how we define that will really be significant in terms of how we understand what we're seeking when we try to feel better. So our current treatment context, I think, lives inside that area. When Larry went to school for this career and profession, he was taught that the goal of therapy was to seek reality, to help people come more toward the truth of their lives, kind of deal with what's real in their lives. By the time I got to school in the mid-90s, when I went back to school for this field, it was in transition, and there were already most of the textbooks that I was taught out of had right there in print in the front paragraph that the goal was to help people feel better. So there was a really significant shift that's happened just in the last 20 years in terms of what therapy is for. There have also been recent developments like, for example, going back to the 1950s, when we think about kind of the definition of mental health and mental illness, starting in about the 1950s when the first major tranquilizers were marketed, and they were very helpful for people with anxiety. They were also very helpful for relieving distress, that kind of thing. And they were an immediate hit. So then what we have developing from there is I think it was, so that's in the 50s. Then in the late 80s, Prozac came along. And so about the same time that Prozac came along, the Manual of Diagnosis, which this field relies on, the DSM, was in its third version and was being revised to become the fourth version, which came out in the early 90s. But the late 80s revised it. The concern was that people didn't have clear enough diagnostic definitions for who they were treating and how they were recommending things. And so that next edition of the DSM came out with a lot more symptoms. So like it listed symptoms and said, if this person has these symptoms, that means they have major depressive disorder, or they have generalized anxiety disorder. And I think that was a real turn in the field for a number of reasons. There's a couple of books that you might find interesting about this. For one thing, and I don't have the statistics in my head, but I found it interesting that, so with the advent of like Thorazine, there was a certain percentage of people that would have been diagnosed with mental illness. By the time Prozac comes along, and then beyond Prozac into now, the incidence of mental illness has skyrocketed. So pretty much if you use the DSM, you could diagnose anybody with something. And that's part of the problem, is that we have kind of used this model and expanded it so widely that there's everything that's maybe in the range of normal human emotion is now considered a disorder. And so the books that I'm referring to, a couple of books, one is called Better Than Well, American Medicine Meets American Dream. And this came out in maybe the early 2000s. And those authors kind of point to the emphasis on individual identity and self-fulfillment as goals of treatment. And so Better Than Well is kind of this idea that, you don't have to feel bad. We can fix that for you, and you just don't have to feel bad. Another guy named, I think it was Alan Horowitz and Jerome Wakefield, came out with a book, not sure when their book came out, probably 8 or 10 years ago, called The Loss of Sadness, How Psychiatry Transformed Normal Sorrow into Depressive Disorder. And those authors want to make a really clear distinction between what is an actual depressive disorder, which does exist. I'm not trying to say those things don't exist. They do. But he wants to make a distinction between what is a normal human experience of sadness, because that's what we have redefined so thoroughly, is that if you feel bad about anything, you need treatment or something's really wrong with you. And that, I think, grows out of this cultural context that we value efficiency. We don't want people to take time off for bereavement. We just want to keep going. And we also have kind of this national, pull yourself up by the bootstraps sort of culture that we're in. And all of those things collide with these things. So in that book, he points out the emphasis is on kind of pathologizing normal sadness because of our value of efficiency.
What's the pathology associated with that?
Yeah, we could probably name that. But is it Rush Week still or something?
Yes, it is.
Wow. Bye. It's okay. And then the other book that I thought was really interesting is by a guy named Christopher Lane, and the title of his book is Shyness, How Normal Behavior Became a Sickness. And that book is a similar thing with social phobia or social anxiety. We've named it this rather than shyness. What we used to call shyness or even introversion is now a problem. And I think that speaks to our national and cultural emphasis on outwardness. We respect and value progress and engagement and all these things that you have to come out to do. And so people who are more inward, more quiet, more shy, or introverted are seen as not well. And I just think this is a huge problem, obviously, because we just have a lot of variety in how we work. So the other thing that the authors of the Loss of Sadness book emphasize is that is kind of the importance of grief and sort of what grief does for us, what it can offer us in terms of understanding the value of our lives, understanding what we love, understanding what gives us meaning. Those are things that are so rich and so full that you can't really get if you stay on the surface of things and don't allow yourself to feel the losses that we inevitably experience in our lives. And so and I would also argue that cutting ourselves off from sadness and pain in our lives also has this effect of cutting us off from a fuller experience of joy and living, kind of finding meaning. Viktor Frankl famously said, if there is meaning in life at all, there must be meaning in suffering. In his work, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote it in the concentration camp. He was a German psychiatrist German-Jewish psychiatrist who ended up in the concentration camps and lived through it. He wrote a manuscript of this book that was lost to him, and then he rewrote it after he got out. But one of the things he observed in his time there was that many of the camp prisoners would talk about, we must survive in order for this to have meaning. We must survive. And he said, and that's where he kind of brings this in, is if there's no meaning, it doesn't matter if we survive. there has to be meaning even if we don't survive. And so that's kind of where that famous quote came from. And so I think this is in some way what we have to face into is that this is the life that this is the world that God has put us in, that is very broken and full of difficulty and full of struggle. And we don't want that. I mean, it's uncomfortable. Of course we're going to avoid it when we can. But if we avoid it too much, then we cut ourselves off from the opportunity to find meaning and understanding of what we value. Our losses and our grieving bring us to a greater various character traits. They bring out compassion in us. They bring out character traits that are really valuable, perseverance, and even virtue, in the sense of what I was saying about eudaimonia, kind of a sense of like, this is what really in a way builds our worth as humans, is how we respond to whatever circumstances we're in. So that was another observation that Viktor Frankl made, was that that he talks about human freedom not being the freedom from our circumstances, but freedom toward our circumstances. And so we don't get to choose often what we're born into or what happens to us in our lives, but we do get to choose how we respond to those things. And that's where human freedom lives for Frankl. And I think that's a really powerful understanding, that it's in our response to what is difficult. And even Paul talks about in Romans that that's where we really know whether or not we have faith on a certain level. Because if we respond with a fist raised to God and say, you can't do this, I know better than you what's right or wrong, and this is wrong, and I'm going to put myself over God and say that. Now, in the midst of our struggle, I've had my fist raised many times, for sure. So it isn't that we don't struggle, but it is that we end up submitting to who God is and to his, to the script that he's writing for us. Can I get a drink of water? Could somebody grab me a drink of water? Oh, I was going to cough. I'm used to, when I'm talking on my headset, I always pull that away, to cough, because I don't want to deafen somebody. It's just kind of automatically doing that. Thank you, dear. Okay. So I'm going to go on about that a little bit more, but in the meantime, any thoughts or questions or observations? We're going to have a really short class, you guys.
That's right.
Okay. So did I. You were scratching your head. Yeah. Right. Okay, so let's see. I have a couple of different directions I want to go. I'm going to go with the old definition that the goal is to seek truth, although I think feeling better is also important, because unless we feel better, it's harder to seek truth. And so there are certainly times when life becomes so overwhelming or our coping becomes so limited that we really can't do much more than work at finding solutions to actually being able to be in our lives in a different way and to feel better. For the purpose, though, of knowing what the truth and reality is. And the ironic thing is, one of the ironic things is that I often talk with people who, in my office, find kind of land with something that's very difficult to know about their lives. Some long ago grief or some loss that they hadn't really grieved, and it just bowls them over. What I often hear is, it's so much better to know the truth about it than to have to stay up here about it and pretend it isn't happening. And so I think that that's such an interesting thing, because actually dipping into what's difficult can be so incredibly grounding because it's real. And I think we just gravitate toward that the real is is solid. We don't have to pretend. We can be in how difficult it is, and we can find connection there. We can find company there because none of us is not impacted. So, okay. So, I just gave away my answer because my answer is it feeling better or seeking truth? It's both. But I was going to save that, for the big crescendo at the end. But I think what I'll go with now is one of the authors that I have really appreciated over time and continue to appreciate is Scott Peck. He wrote a book in the 80s called The Road Less Traveled. And his definition of mental health is one of my favorites. And I want to read it in the context of kind of the paragraph that he says it in. So it's a little bit long, but I want to read this. Truth or reality is avoided when it is painful. We can revise our maps only when we have the discipline not to avoid pain and effort. To have such discipline, we must be totally dedicated to the truth, not partially. That is to say, we must always hold truth, as best as we can determine it, to be more crucial, more vital to our self-interest than our comfort. Conversely, we must always consider our personal discomfort relatively unimportant, and indeed even welcome it in the service of the search for truth. Mental health is an ongoing process of dedication to reality at all costs. What does this life of total dedication to the truth mean? It means, above all, a life of continuous and never-ending stringent self-examination and honesty with oneself. So, the nugget there, the definition, mental health is an ongoing process of dedication to reality at all costs. Enough said. Actually, there's a lot more to be said, because what does that look like and how do we do that? And that's what I want to kind of move into talking about. One of the things that I find often in my work is that people come in with a diagnosis that is a difficult diagnosis, like, say, bipolar disorder. I'll just use an example. Bipolar disorder. They were given that diagnosis some time ago, and it has become part of their identity. And they have kind of become understanding that this is something that will be true for them from now on. And I want to really contest that notion, because what I've seen is that so many of our symptoms, and this kind of goes with what Peck is talking about, so many of our symptoms, if we listen to what he's saying, is that they are in our service. They are in the service of our search for truth. So when we have symptoms, they're flashlights, kind of like indicator lights on a dashboard. And they point us often to what we have missed, in what we have not, especially in this culture, what we have not grieved, what we have not known that we have lost. And they become an opportunity to notice that and to move toward that. And I do a lot of work with trauma recovery, and what I see often is when people begin to work with their traumas, those symptoms that were defined as bipolar disorder begin to not be needed, and people can indeed recover and not have those symptoms anymore. And that's true with many of the diagnoses that I've worked with. So I just want to emphasize that I think this model is actually really helpful to understand that that the diagnoses that we use are, I think we kind of have a cultural notion that once you have one of those diagnoses, that you are that. And so I always want to say, not necessarily. It could be a pointer. It could be a pointer to help us move in a different direction. So one of the kind of little things that I draw sometimes, and this is by no means publishable or definitive because it's not that good. But if we think of reality as being a point, which of course in our culture that's definable by anything and everyone at this point, which is another issue. But I'm going to propose that there is actually a true reality that that this is talking about, that if we can pursue this true reality, we can find mental health. And then there's maybe non-reality. And so if you think about this model of mental health and mental illness, as we move this way down this continuum, there's going to be symptoms that come, and maybe the first ones are anxiety and depression. And of course, this speaks from Freud that we're all neurotic. You kind of heard him say that probably. But so there's the normal, which is neurosis, because we are all neurotic. These are very common symptoms, in other words, and they can be. This can be grief, for example, and it's going to be temporary, but it might be a long time. Some cultures, if you don't grieve for a solid year, you're suspect, like something's wrong, like you didn't love this person enough. And in our culture, you're lucky to get a week of bereavement leave, which is, don't get me started. But anyway, and then there might be like bipolar disorder or something harder. But then you might go all the way into, maybe there's, like we might put personality disorders here, which interestingly used to be called characterological disorders. So this band of diagnoses involved symptoms such as an unwillingness to be self-reflective, or an impulse to always put the problem outside and not be able to take on very much. And so that was seen as a character problem, and now it's kind of been translated into a personality problem. And I think it's complicated, but anyway. Then you might go all the way into what we might call psychosis, which is diagnoses like schizophrenia, where reality is actually lost to some people on that band. Now, I want to clarify that some schizophrenia and some mental illness in general is organic, can happen as a result of head injury, can happen, a lot of different things can cause different disorders. I'm just reaching when I say I think probably 10% of the diagnoses in the DSM are in that category. I haven't counted it or anything, but I think a lot are in this category of like, we can move toward reality and find some healing if that choice is made. Did you have a question a while ago? Yeah. What's neurosis?
What's neurosis?
Good question. I'm not sure how to define it. How would you define it? Yeah, how would I define it?
It's kind of a normal, natural anxiety about life. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This is off the top of my head. So when Freud talks about neurosis, it's just the normal anxiety that we all experience day to day, just about living.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have it.
Mm-hmm. It can be depression as well. It can be a number of different symptoms, but it's basically, his idea is that it's a reaction to the stress of life, whatever that reaction happens to be. And so that's where I think it's interesting, because that was never sort of, historically it's been seen as like, that's life. It's kind of part of life to work with difficult feelings, to work with losses, to know what it means to lose what you love and to struggle with that. And you can see where we've been sliding into this place of no, don't feel bad, you know. But instead, the tensions of the ways that we feel bad can be these pointers toward understanding something that's actually very significant. So this is something that I kind of sometimes offer to people because of that model that says once you're diagnosed with something, you're always going to be there. There's even some really interesting research, honestly, about the treatment of schizophrenia with there's some studies that indicate that one episode being treated in a particular way doesn't necessarily lead to a chronic illness, but that that often some of the medication-related treatments are actually, those are more likely to lead to a chronic form. And so we have this real mix with all the medications that are available. It's a real hard thing to decide, like, when is a medication really going to be helpful? When is it going to be something that actually is really harmful? I've seen both. I have seen medications save people's lives, and I've also seen them be very harmful, and when they were saved when they got off of them. So there's just quite a spectrum. And I you know, so I think it's great that we have options out there that are helpful to people. I would always recommend that those things be coupled with working toward understanding what's happening, so that there can be movement toward whatever the reality is that we tend to avoid when it's painful, like Peck says. So.
Could you say that medications are moving people further from reality?
Not across the board, no. I think that they're likely very overprescribed at this point, and in that sense, they could help people miss the symptoms that could point them toward reality. But I think that it's kind of part of that feeling better in order to do the work thing that I was saying earlier. I think that sometimes they can be really helpful to bring people into a place where they're able to do the work of self-examination, and so I don't like to say anything across the board because they're extremely helpful for some people, and then I've seen some people take them and kind of go, okay, I'm okay now, and never ask the questions again, you know. So.
Do you think that's because they're living too much in, some people could be living too much in reality?
Which part?
Like the medicines are helping them because they're living so much in reality that reality's causing them so much distress.
Oh, I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. Are you asking if there are some people who live so much in reality that it's like too much? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, yes. So, yeah, maybe this is where I would shift into talking a little bit about how the body responds to difficult things, because there is also physiological response, and that's where the medications can come in and be helpful. But there's also things that can be added to that or used instead of, or, you know, just depends, to help people who, I guess the way I would answer it succinctly what you're asking is, sometimes the reality for some people is so difficult that their bodies can't really be in it, and so they might kind of shut down or leave or have different symptoms. So if that's what you mean, then I think reality is too much sometimes. Yeah. And it's too much for the resources available. So, but I do think that with resources and with care, you know, another thing that's happened in our culture along the same way is that if you think about, I mean, it's a fascinating and difficult sociological study to look at how much just in the last 20 years, not to mention the last 50 years, kids don't grow up in intact families anymore. we don't really have communities in the same way that we did 50 years ago. And humans need each other. We are a colonial species, if I could say it that way. I remember one time when I was in my own difficult place and kind of working with not wanting to be a human being in some ways, like, because, they hurt you. And kind of being a bit of a loner at that point and kind of like standoffish, kind of, I'm cooler than anybody else. But I remember this moment when I was struggling with that and kind of thinking about the need that I did feel for relationships and kind of the tension of those two things. And I was on a beach on the Gulf of Mexico with a friend of mine, and I walked way far away from the crowd. And the beaches down there are crowded. The ones here, not so much, but but they're pretty crowded down there. And I walked way far away from the people, and this big thunderstorm came, which I loved. And I watched from a distance these people just kind of scattering, and like they were all just like picking up their stuff and like getting ready to run, from the storm. And I just had this image of like, they're ants. They're like little ants. They're just like, because I was far enough away, I guess. And then I'm like, I better go. But it was so interesting because what I realized was I'm an ant, I'm one of those people that need people. And we are communal people. We need relationships and we need each other. And I think that is another big contributor to the rise in mental illness diagnosis in the last 20 years, is that we don't connect the same way that we did. So, not that it's ever been perfect, but our society has definitely crumbled a bit in that regard in the last 20 to 50 years. So, thoughts, questions?
Is there any way of tying that observation about the nature of community and connection that humans have with what you were talking about with regard to meaning in the past? I mean, is it that the connection is just sort of an integral part of our nature, or is it because the lack of connection gives us a lack of meaning, or is it some combination of those, or is there no connection whatsoever? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on the role of human connection and meaning or anything like that.
I think they're very connected. I think, for one thing, if we think about kind of that idea of eudaimonia and the meaning that comes from doing virtue, we can't really do virtue in an isolated way, in some way. I mean, we interact with each other, and we interact in relationship, and that's really where we're challenged to decide what kind of person am I going to be in this relationship right now. And I think that's really where those things overlap, is our connection with each other is where we practice virtue and therefore find meaning. It's also where we feel pain, where we feel hurt and rejection and disappointment. And we get to work with, what does that mean? It's also where we work with loss. Someone that's very important to us dies. There's difficult things that happen, and it's in the context of all of those myriad connections that all of those things happen that shape us. That address it? So yeah, I would definitely say so. Okay. So, how about if I talk a little bit about the physiological part? That'd be helpful. Okay. This is a picture that I think can be helpful in understanding kind of where we live. If this is sort of the body at steady state, kind of regulated, we're good. There's ups and downs, but we're kind of in the zone of feeling present, connected. I'm not having symptoms. In other words, I'm okay. Pretty grounded, just okay. And then I'm driving my car down the freeway, and somebody cuts me off, and my body jolts, and I swerve, and my body goes like that. And I get all this adrenaline and cortisol and norepinephrine and all these different things flood into my system. And I don't have to think about it. It's happening in a different part of the brain. And I swerve and I miss getting hit. And I'm good. And then I pull off the road 5 minutes later and my body just starts shaking. You ever had that experience? Your body just starts to shake. Well, that is your body going releasing all of that. It dumps in the stuff that's going to dissolve the cortisol and the adrenaline and the norepinephrine and all that. It's going to take care of it, but because it happens so quickly, it's going to take care of it really quickly, and you go through this dump, and that's when your body shakes. And so it's really important to let your body do that, because that releases the experience, and then it settles back into a regulated experience. So the trouble with us is we tend to go, just drive, just go, But if you can, do pull over and shake when that happens, because it's much better for your body. But we're socialized into, just keep going. And so this is also true when we're in difficult, stressful circumstances, whatever they are, whether it's actual grief or loss, or whether it's a deadline at work, whatever it is that stresses us, then our bodies do the same response physiologically, but it might continue for a while. And it might not ever do this big release thing. And then what happens is, it goes on for a while, finally my body is just done. It's kind of like what you were talking about. And the next thing my body does to help me survive is it goes into a freeze. And so this is kind of like what possums do when they play dead. It's a survival mechanism. So if I'm a gazelle, and there's some amazing videos on YouTube that you can watch of like a gazelle being chased, caught by a lion, the lion, and it's dead. It's out. And the lion goes off to get the cubs or whatever, and the gazelle's like, boom, out and running. So it's definitely a survival mechanism. It's really awesome. It doesn't work as well in our culture, but that is what our bodies are trying to do, is protect us. And so what happens then when our bodies kind of get into a more, what I would call, dysregulated state, is that this is like maybe described as depression, or frozen, or numb, or stuck. A lot of different words we use for it. And it might go back and forth a little bit, and we might feel like we're panicked or anxious or worked up. And over time, if we stay in this state for a long time, then these two lines actually get more and more narrow, and there's less room before it pops out of that zone of tolerance. And for very traumatized people, that zone can be very narrow, so that there isn't much room for positive or negative experiences before these symptoms just explode in us, right? And so part of the work, this is the other piece I was going to say, in the last 10 to 15 years, maybe 15 or so, there's been an explosion of research and work done in neuroscience that because of brain imaging technology mainly, they can actually look at what's happening in the brain in different parts of the brain. And so a lot of this has been understood a lot more clearly. And so there have been a number of different treatments devised that take this into account and that help the body recover from difficult things that have happened. And so it's very hopeful. It's very promising. And it's one of the kinds of therapy that I do quite often with people. I forgot where I was going to go with that. That in the work, so in one of the ways to help this expand with someone who has become very limited is to actually work with the body sensations that happen and bring them up kind of over that line and then help it release a little bit. And so you go a little bit up and then you release. And so none of this, none of this big stuff, but very subtle changes in tracking sensations and letting them finish in the body can actually really start to expand this range and bring these points in toward that range. One of the things that I find really encouraging in my work with people is when someone comes in and says, that same thing happened, but my body didn't react the same way. And we're like, yes. There you go. I mean, there's so much healing available just by working with how the body responds to these things. So that's part of what I'm saying about it's important to be able to feel better. Because in here is where we have clarity and groundedness and perspective and social connection. Because in here we have our whole brain to use. We have where our feelings live in the amygdala, the hippocampus, right? My brain anatomy is rusty. But we also have the prefrontal cortex, which is where social engagement happens, where we can actually see each other and reflect and be in relationship. That's engaged. It's there. When this is happening, it's the survival part of the brain that gets going. And you don't really need to think a lot if you're running from a tiger, right? You don't need to do algebra, and you don't need to have a picnic with a friend either. So you really just want to get out of there. And that's what your brain is telling you when we're in this heightened thing. And it isn't that the goal is to never be there, but the goal is that my body knows how to put me back here. So because life is difficult, right? Life is going to activate us. But if we can find ways to let it release into this more regulated place. So, is this too weird? Yeah.
What would be the opposite of the little narrow spectrum that you're talking about? Like someone's spectrum is very narrow. Like is it possible their lines are just so far up in here and down here they don't experience emotion. They're just kind of flatliners. No.
No. If they have that kind of thing, they're probably here.
Down. Okay. Down.
Yeah. If they're more flatline or not feeling emotion.
But they're
because the
outside.
normal state for us is to feel emotion and to
Okay.
be able to work with it. So, I mean, you could meet someone who's pretty broad in here and is pretty unflappable, perhaps would be the word. Not easily activated. But I think that, and that's great. But there would definitely be, one of the ways that I try to help people define this for themselves is, when do you feel the most like you? When do you feel like, are you present? Are you engaged? Are you clear? Can you do what you love? These kinds of things. And so in this place, there is a lot of engagement. And so it's not a Zen, and in fact, I distinguish it sometimes for people because sometimes I'm just so relaxed when I'm there. I feel really relaxed. Well, relaxation is great, but that's not all the story here, because this is also when we might be really on and getting things done and feeling really productive because I'm focused, right? Does that make sense? That it isn't just like, but it's, I'm here, I'm ready, I'm good. So, yeah. So the reason I went into all that is to talk about kind of what's true about our bodies, what's true about how life impacts our bodies, and kind of where we have the options of going with that. And we have a lot of different options of where we can go with that. But I was also going to, I think I'll save this for next time. I was going to talk a little bit about feelings and how feelings work and what the role of emotions is in all this. The body part, I think, is kind of foundational. And then, because here, if the body can be engaged, if we have the brain on track, then we can feel, we can have emotion, and we can have cognition, we can think well. So we can kind of function on all cylinders in a way, in a good way. So, but I might talk more thoroughly about emotions next time. One of the things I wanted to come to is back to Scott Peck's paragraph, that I might actually read a little bit of that again, just to bring it back. Let me do that. Truth or reality is avoided when it is painful. We can revise our maps only when we have the discipline not to avoid pain and effort. To have such discipline, we must be totally dedicated to the truth, not partially. That is to say, we must always hold truth, as best as we can determine it, to be more crucial, more vital to our self-interest than our comfort. So he's saying that our comfort has to be secondary to seeking the truth. It takes effort and intention to seek truth. So we must always consider our personal discomfort relatively unimportant, and indeed even welcome it in the service of the search of truth. Mental health is an ongoing process of dedication to reality at all costs. And I don't know if this will complicate things or simplify things, but I would also argue that as broken people, we definitely resist reality. We resist our discomfort. And it's apparent by looking at Scripture and looking at our lives that God is not as interested in our comfort as we are either. That there are things far more important in God's economy than our being comfortable. And that is where our growth comes from. And so I would also just observe that I think that we really don't seek reality well. We don't seek it at all, apart from the Spirit of God invading us and drawing us. And, I don't, probably an out of context interpretation possibly, but when Jesus said, I will send you another comforter and he will lead you into all the truth. Sometimes I think what he meant was all the truth. The truth about how desperately I need his mercy. The truth about how difficult I find it to love people. The truth about how difficult I find it sometimes to love myself. Those are really difficult truths. And yet it's only when we really face into the reality of our brokenness that we can seek and find mercy from God, which is broadly available from him. So I think I want to start finishing with time for discussion in talking about also the presence of joy. Someone said to me recently that they were very moved when a friend of theirs said to them, well, I don't think so much about happiness, but I do find joy. And I think that speaks to this definition that we're using of happiness, that if happiness is the absence of pain, then we may not have that. But there is a deep and abiding joy that can come from kind of being in reality and finding the truth that is grounding, even if it's painful. And I'm struck by people like C.S. Lewis, who, when he wrote Surprised by Joy, his whole thing in that memoir is that he everybody talks about the problem of suffering, but he was saying, but we need to talk about the problem of joy. Because apart from the existence of a benevolent God, how do we explain joy? and beauty and goodness. And I think that's where so much of this can bring us back into some regulation if we can take in the experience of our senses, the beauty around us, the goodness that we see. I mean, I just saw the Mr. Rogers movie. It was fabulous. You guys have to see it if you haven't seen it. But he's the one that quoted I guess it was from his dad, that when there's disaster, look for the helpers. And I think even that is a thing of beauty, is to see people's compassion come forward in the midst of tremendous difficulty. I just heard a story about a woman who was going up an escalator behind a woman who was at an airport, and she was carrying her luggage and a cup of coffee and kind of not holding on because of that, and she fell backwards down the escalator, and kind of where this person that told me the story was sort of down the way, or maybe she was like, I think she couldn't really get to her because she was kind of going the other way or something, but she was watching. And she said by the time this woman got to the bottom of the escalator, there was a crowd of people there to help her, all strangers. And she was, I think, ended up taken to the hospital because she was very injured. But this is like complete strangers jumping in to help someone who was all alone. And that's, again, kind of this sense of like, we are in this together, in some way. And even with total strangers doing an act of kindness like that. The only thing that shows up on the news is the bad news, but there's lots of good news that, of people really trying to care about each other. And I think there's a lot of beauty and a lot of joy in that. Dostoevsky actually said famously that beauty will save the world. And I'm going to close with my other favorite quotes by another Russian, Solzhenitsyn, who lived, as you may know, in a work camp for many years as a political prisoner and suffered terribly there. And he said, "Bless you, prison, for having been in my life. For it was there that I discovered that the meaning of earthly existence lies not, as we have grown used to thinking, in prospering, but in the development of the soul." So I'll close with that. Thoughts, ideas, questions, experiences.
Thanks for that, Nancy. My question is, do you think that our culture has attempted to wrench all meaning from suffering? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Just trying to take meaning out of suffering. I think they've tried to take suffering out of suffering. So I don't know if meaning is even really a question. Meaning, I think, in our culture these days is so individualized. And it, I don't know. Yeah, what do you think? How would you answer that? I'm going to, that's a trick. I'm going to turn the questions back on you. No?
Be warned, question askers. Well, it seems to me that in part, the question comes up for me because it seems like we as a culture have a hard time coping with suffering, and the go-to is kind of like the fist shaking or no God would possibly do that, therefore there's no God, which is kind of like where some can go in the culture. I think it's where a lot of people in our culture end up.
Yes.
Either incidentally or deliberately, sort of thing. And I wonder if permitting suffering to have meaning leaves room for the concept of a God who orchestrates reality up against, well, my suffering has no meaning, so either all animals kind of chasing each other, or the kind of God that's worth believing in doesn't exist, sort of thing. That's kind of where my question is coming from, and I was wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I think that we've definitely kind of, God is not in the picture. And so any meaning we find is kind of down here in this lower story. And as a result, it doesn't extend past, in the context of that worldview anyway, it doesn't extend past death. And so there's not a lot, there's kind of a move toward, I have to make everything count here now because there's nothing beyond. But I have always found that kind of hollow, because kind of like Frankel talked about, with my quote from him, that if there's meaning in life at all, there must be meaning in suffering. It's like, if there's no meaning beyond here, then what's the goal of suffering here? Why? And so.
Oh, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you characterize, do you interact with people who have kind of like pushed God out of the option box and still yet strive to find the meaning in the suffering then that they're undergoing? Mm-hmm. Is that something you run into?
I find, yes, I do work with a lot of people who wouldn't claim any kind of belief in God or anything like that. And there is still a lot of meaning that can be found. And I think of my work, when we think about like seeking truth or feeling better, I do think of my work as both. And I feel like my job is to clear the way for truth to become apparent in a way. And so even if I'm working with someone who doesn't believe in God, that's not really my job, is kind of how I look at it, is like, my job is to clear the obstacles so that they can figure out about God sometime, some way. And because God ultimately has to show up and do that, right? It's not I can't do it. So I think that my goal is to really, point people toward meaning. And there's an interesting observation I'll make, that I feel like in our culture, therapists have become kind of the new spiritual leaders in a way, because people don't really do church as a culture. We don't really do church as much as once the culture did. And yet people are still so searching for meaning that they go to a therapist, and with whatever existential crisis they might have, including really difficult symptoms. So I just find that interesting, because sometimes I really see my role as more spiritual director, and I certainly do love working with people who are struggling with their faith. That's one of my favorite kinds of work, because we have a lot of places to go with that I'm maybe more familiar with as well. But I work with a lot of people who would find tremendous meaning in other worldviews, in Buddhism, or kind of even a mishmash of something that they put together. But I feel like all of those things are pointers. If we're pursuing reality, if we're looking toward pursuing reality, then whatever that truth is, or whatever that reality is going to very possibly lead them toward knowing who God is. And that's all I get to do. That's the only part I get to play in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Talking about two of my favorite subjects, meaning and truth.
All right. Mine too.
I read a book by one of my favorite guys of all time, Michael Polanyi, and the name of the book was Meaning of All Things. And he provided me an insight that I thought was incredibly interesting. I was talking with Tricia in the kitchen the other day about this, that in the way that he was thinking about it, to find meaning is to put some event, action, word, idea in the context of some larger superstructure, some larger story, some larger organizational structure of some sort. Yeah. So the smaller thing, which has meaning, is meaningful insofar as it fits and works and like a jigsaw puzzle piece fits into the puzzle or the structure that you have up here that's sort of a higher level in some sense. And if you think about like a word has meaning because it is playing a part and giving significance in some sense to the sentence that it is a part of. So there is meaning of the word because it fits into the structure of the sentence. And it seems like suffering is a tricky one because what is the structure that we're going to put in our lives? What is the structure? What is the way we're looking at the world so that suffering fits into that in a way that is not just miserable and painful? Does that make sense? And if there's no way of fitting what I am suffering into some structure that makes sense of what I'm suffering, then it's really hard to find meaning in it. It seems to me. So I mean, you could have groups that or people that are found a structure of some sort, okay, and they're trying to fit all of their experiences within that structure. It could be, like you were saying, Buddhism or some other mishmash of something else that they're trying to fit into there. Or it could be Christianity. They're fitting the suffering that they have in terms of how that fits in the structure of what God is doing and who I am and where I'm ending up and where I'm going and how this is part of the story that God is giving me in my life and all that kind of stuff like that. Then it seems like those sorts of things can be very, very meaningful. I don't know.
Yeah.
And then you said something about it being hollow, which I thought was really good because if you create a structure that is not true. Okay, so here we get back to my other favorite idea is truth. If you create a structure which is not true, it's a structure that doesn't actually correspond to the way things really are. Then you're trying to find meaning and put it in the structure, but the structure is not true, so it's really hard to make it fit, and the whole thing just sort of, it doesn't quite work. It's hollow. It doesn't actually give the meaning that you're looking for because you can't fit it into that structure. The true structure that really exists. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that, but that to me makes a lot of sense of some of those concepts and things of that sort. So
yeah,
anyway.
very much. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It kind of takes me back to Schaeffer's. I forget how he drew it, but he had a graphic that did the whole and it's similar to I think what we're talking about. Like when we move away from reality, get symptoms, and they're a gift. They're a gift from God to point us to, wait, something's going on that you need to listen to, and that's a really good. And so the smoother, I guess I'm thinking of what's that word that like textual resistance when you're interpreting a text, and you're trying really hard to like make it mean something that it doesn't mean. And it bumps, it's like it bumps, and then you finally like come up with a different interpretation that is more what it means, and it goes, kind of just smooths it out, right? And I think the same is true for reality in that sense, and with truth, when we have something that isn't true and we try to make it true, it's going to keep bumping. And sometimes I think of these symptoms as those bumps because we're taking off into a direction that is like bumping into reality, right? That isn't fitting. And so the more we can listen to those things and back up and go, okay, where did I put the wrong word into this right sentence or whatever? But I think it's a great illustration.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
I'm not exactly sure how to ask the question, so I'm going to try.
Okay.
Thinking about, like, I have at least known people and observed, like, there's always a problem. There's always a crisis. And observing that wearing on the people who are kind of in their lives as, like, okay, this is hard. And this is kind of overburdening people. And not wanting to be that kind of person, is sort of can lead in this other direction of pride of like, I'm okay. I don't need to have other people care about me.
Right.
So can you talk about like, because clearly we do need other people to care about us. We're all broken. We all do burden each other. And that's just going to be part of what we do in our brokenness. So can you talk about like appropriate context for seeking care?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are some of the ways that that works well?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I don't
Yeah,
know.
it does, absolutely. And I think that's a good observation, that there's a continuum. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I think we protect ourselves by either oversharing or withdrawing, or we can anyway. And it's hard to find kind of the balance. One of the places where along this continuum that I was drawing, that I think is a helpful distinction, is kind of really working to look at, and this is Larry's teaching from whenever he did it last, but the idea of the self-protections and sort of how we interact with each other, that the goal in a conflict is to look at my participation in it. So it's going to be the most helpful when I can turn the mirror in and look at me. And I think that's also true when we're, that's kind of in a relational conflict. But in relational caring for each other, when we're leaning in and trying to care about each other, there's also kind of a line of like, is this person asking me to do work that they really need to be doing for themselves? Or am I, in fact, like not asking people to come alongside me because I fear the vulnerability of that? There's that continuum. And so I think the question for us, for ourselves and for the other, is I think it's not loving to do somebody else's work for them when they can and should be doing it for themselves. But what that doesn't mean is that they need to be alone in it. And so to be together doesn't mean I'm tangled up or in mesh necessarily, but it means I'm with you. I'm side by side with you. And you said it really well, because we all need that, and we all can be together in our hurts and in our brokenness. And I think even kind of the patience and the compassion that develops in the process of sitting with someone who's in a lot of pain is profound. And I think that we can avoid that because of our own discomfort with it. But that discomfort is our discomfort with our own pain, reflected in the other. And so to really work with what I'm bringing to it myself, and where my pain is going to interrupt my ability to care about somebody, I've got to work with that. Does that make sense? Is that at all kind of where you were going with that?
Yeah,
okay.
I think I guess another piece of it too is like, I think you touched on it most when you said like not expecting somebody else to do, well, you were saying not doing someone else's work for them, but then as the person who's seeking care, not looking for what do you think that looks like on the part of someone who needs care, asking someone else to do too much?
Well, I think it's messy, and I think there's not a solid line that's never going to be crossed. It's probably going to be crossed, and then it's been crossed, right? And then you go, oh, I think I had to pull back, right? And so there, it's not clean and neat. But I think what it could look like is, well, I don't know. It's hard to say. It can look a lot of different ways. It might look like, now this is the person who's asking too much of the other person. Is that the one you were specifically asking about?
Yeah.
Okay. If I'm asking more than what this person has to give, then it might look like me not respecting their boundary, maybe. If they say they have to go, or I got to hang up now, and I keep talking, maybe that's one way it could look. I don't know. That's the thought that came to mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that does. Yeah, just trying to continue even as you're needing care, to not lose sight of that this other person is a person who also needs my respect from me, or something like that. Right. Which can be hard to do when you're suffering.
Well,
but
it is, and I think actually, quite honestly, we can be too boundaried when it comes to being with someone who's really in a lot of pain. It's like, you know what? Just do too much if that's if you want to err on one of the sides or the other. That's the side to err on, I think. And I don't think that means you're doing their work for them or that you're asking someone to do your work for you. But I think that if you think about sort of cultural norms of, for example, in grief, when someone dies, I'm so moved always by Jewish tradition. There's such powerful examples of when someone dies in Jewish culture, they sit Shiva with the body, and the people who are close to the family sit with the person who's grieving, and they will do that for 24 hours minimum. They just sit, and they don't say anything. They just sit, and I think that's really powerful. That to be with someone who's in a lot of pain and just be. And maybe that's part of the answer to what you're asking is we don't really have to do much. We can't really fix it for each other, but we can be together. We can support each other in that way.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Mm-hmm.
So, Karina, just to piggyback on that, what Nancy said is absolutely true. As a therapist, and when I have trained counselors, beginning counselors and sometimes experienced counselors, will want to take the pain away because they want them to feel better. And part of why we want to take others' pain away is because we don't want to feel their pain either. So we're more comfortable if they're not in pain. But one of the things that I just would harp on with students was, don't take their pain away. That pain's there for a reason. And let that pain work through, as miserable as it is for that person and for you. Let them suffer through it and just be beside them as they do it. There's such a human need to take that pain away and fix it. And that's the worst thing we can do because it'll just resurface. And it might resurface at a time when they're all alone. So being with them through that pain and hopefully helping them understand how beneficial that pain eventually can be. But it's a long process.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very, very good. And that's kind of what I was saying about it's really our own pain that we fear when when we want to fix somebody else's. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have noticed for myself at least that a connection, reluctance to ask for help, being connected to, I know that I would not be very patient with somebody else coming and asking the same kind of thing. And that being sort of like a mirror of like, is that good? Is it really a virtue that I don't want to impose on someone? But really what I'm saying is if this person needed this from me, I wouldn't I wouldn't want to give that. And trying to figure out, what is that? Is that good? Is that bad? It's probably not flattering. It's not a comfortable thing to realize. Yeah.
That's very insightful. Yeah. Very, very important to notice that. Yeah. So that it's kind of like on the other side of, doing too much to try to fix somebody is like staying away out of my own, like, I don't know if I want to give that to them. That's kind of what you're saying. Yeah. We're messy.
Yeah.
We're messy people. Is that enough for tonight? Okay. Thanks for being here.